She didn't wake up one day and realize she was different. There was no moment of clarity, no emotional breakthrough, no clear line between who she was and who she was becoming. Life simply continued. Days passed, prayers were prayed, silence remained, obedience stayed quiet. And somewhere in the middle of all that, God was working, not loudly, not visibly, not in ways she could track. Change came without announcement. She had expected transformation to feel obvious, to feel lighter, stronger, more certain. But this change did not come with feeling. It came with steadiness. She noticed it only later, in the way she no longer panicked as quickly, in the way waiting no longer terrified her, in the way silence didn't push her away like it used to. God had been shaping her while she wasn't watching herself, while she was focused on staying, on obeying, on praying. Even when prayer felt dry, she thought nothing was happening. But something was. God was not changing her circumstances first. He was changing her capacity to wait, to trust, to remain faithful without needing reassurance. And that kind of change rarely announces itself. It happens quietly, like roots growing beneath the surface. She realized something unsettling and comforting. At the same time, some of God's deepest work happens without our awareness. Not because He hides it, but because it is not meant to impress us. It is meant to form us. She had been looking for signs that God was doing something, but God had been building something inside her instead. If you are in a season where it feels like nothing is changing, where you are doing the right things without seeing results, where faith feels steady but unremarkable, stay. This message is for the woman who doesn't realize yet how much God has already done within her. And if these words feel close to where you are right now, consider subscribing. Not for the channel, but so your heart always has a place to return when God's work feels slow, quiet, and unseen. Now, let's walk through how God changes us without us realizing it, and why that kind of change lasts the longest. She had always assumed that change would announce itself, that transformation would feel clear, noticeable, impossible to miss. She thought she would feel different. Before she was different. Stronger emotions, greater certainty, clear confidence that God was working. But none of that happened. Instead, change arrived quietly, almost unrecognizably. Her life looked the same on the surface. The same prayers, the same responsibilities, the same waiting. And because nothing obvious shifted, she assumed nothing was happening. But real change rarely feels dramatic, because dramatic change focuses attention outward. Quiet change reshapes us inward. God was not interested in altering her appearance first. He was working beneath it. She realized later that dramatic moments fade quickly. Emotion rises and then settles. Certainty comes and then wavers. Clarity arrives and then questions return. But quiet change endures. It does not depend on feel. It does not require reinforcement. It does not collapse when emotion disappears. God was forming habits of trust, patterns of obedience, a steadiness that did not rely on motivation or reassurance, and that kind of work cannot be rushed. She noticed small things only in hindsight, the way she reacted differently to disappointment, the way she paused before panicking, the way she no longer interpreted silence as rejection. At the time, those moments felt insignificant, but they were evidence of deep change. God was adjusting her reflexes, her assumptions, her internal responses. He was teaching her to remain steady instead of reactive, and that does not feel dramatic. It feels ordinary, which is why so many people mistake formation for stagnation. They assume that if nothing feels intense, nothing is happening. But God does not measure progress by intensity. He measures it by faithfulness, quiet obedience, repeated trust, daily staying. She realized that God was not changing her to impress her. He was changing her to sustain her, so that when difficulty came again, and it would, she would not collapse. So that when silence returned, and it would, she would remain. This kind of change does not feel powerful, but it is, because it is stable. God was not building a moment. He was building a life, and that kind of work rarely announces itself until it is already complete. She was so focused on staying that she didn't notice she was changing. Staying felt passive, unremarkable, almost like survival rather than growth. She wasn't chasing progress. She wasn't measuring outcomes. She was simply choosing not to leave. And that choice, repeated quietly, was reshaping her. God was working in the space between her decisions, between one prayer and the next, between one quiet obedience and another, between one day of faithfulness and the next ordinary day. She thought change required intention, effort, awareness, but God was forming her through repetition, through consistency, when nothing felt rewarding, through obedience, when no one noticed, through prayer, when silence remained. She stayed in Scripture, even when it felt familiar. She stayed in worship, even when it felt muted. She stayed in faith, even when it felt unproductive. And that staying was shaping her inner posture. She began responding differently, without realizing it. Waiting no longer triggered panic. Silence no longer felt like rejection. Delay no longer felt like failure, not because answers came, but because her foundation changed. God was not teaching her how to escape discomfort. He was teaching her how to remain steady within it. She learned patience without trying to, trust without analyzing it, endurance without naming it. These qualities formed while she wasn't paying attention, because formation does not ask for awareness. It asks for availability. She made herself available to God's quiet work simply by staying. God did not interrupt her life to announce progress. He allowed life to continue while he worked beneath it. And slowly, without ceremony, she became someone who could carry more. More waiting, more silence, more responsibility, more trust. She didn't notice the change because God was not changing her to be observed. He was changing her to be faithful. And that kind of transformation is almost always invisible. While it is happening, she didn't recognize the change while it was happening. She noticed it only later, almost accidentally, in moments that surprised her. A situation that once would have overwhelmed her now felt manageable. A delay that once would have stirred anxiety now felt tolerable. A silence that once would have shaken her faith now felt familiar, not threatening. These were not victories she celebrated. They were quiet realizations. She wasn't braver. She wasn't stronger in the way she imagined strength. She was steadier, and steadiness is easy to overlook because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply holds. She realized that her reactions had changed before her beliefs did. She trusted before she could explain why. She waited without rehearsing fear. She remained calm without needing reassurance. God had been reshaping her internal reflexes. The things she once did automatically, panic, comparison, self-protection, no longer rose as quickly. Not because she mastered them, but because God had been quietly softening them. She realized something important. Change is often most visible in how we respond, not in what we feel. Her emotions still fluctuated. Doubt still visited. Questions still appeared, but they no longer controlled her. God had not removed struggle. He had changed her relationship to it. She no longer interpreted difficulty as a sign of failure. She no longer saw silence as a threat. She no longer assumed that waiting meant stagnation, and this awareness came slowly. She didn't wake up transformed. She recognized transformation only when the old patterns failed to appear. That absence was the evidence. God had been undoing what once ruled her while she wasn't watching. And she realized then God's quiet work often shows itself not in new behaviors, but in the disappearance of old ones. Fear lost its urgency, anxiety lost its grip, impatience lost its authority. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to notice. And that noticing came with humility, because she couldn't claim credit. She hadn't planned this change. She hadn't engineered it. She hadn't even tracked it. God had done it while she stayed, and that realization deepened her trust. Because if God could change her without her awareness, He could be trusted. Even when she couldn't see His work, there came a moment, not sudden, not dramatic, when she looked back and recognized God's hand. Not in one event, but across a stretch of time. She saw it in who she had become, in the steadiness she now carried, in the patience that no longer felt forced, in the trust that no longer needed constant reassurance. God had been faithful long before she noticed. He had been working when prayers felt repetitive, when obedience felt small, when silence felt long. She realized that God's faithfulness was not dependent on her awareness of it. He had not waited for her to recognize the change, to complete His work. Because God does not work for applause, even internal applause. He works for formation. She understood then that many seasons only make sense in reverse, that what feels like stagnation is often preparation, that what feels like delay is often deep alignment. God had not been inactive. He had been careful, careful with her heart, careful with her growth, careful not to rush what needed to last. She had wanted progress. She could feel. God had given her transformation. She could carry. And now, looking back, she realized how gently He had led her, without pressure, without force, without overwhelming her. He had allowed her to grow slowly, almost unnoticed, so that the change would belong to her fully. She didn't feel different, because God was not changing her for a moment. He was changing her for a lifetime, and that realization filled her with quiet gratitude. Not excitement, not triumph, gratitude. Because God had been faithful, even when she doubted it, patient, even when she grew tired, present, even when she could not feel Him. She saw now that God had never stopped working. She had simply been living inside the work. In the end, she didn't notice the change, because God was not shaping a feeling. He was shaping her. He was forming a faith that could endure silence, a trust that could survive waiting, an obedience that did not depend on visibility or reward. She was changed, without realizing it, because God's deepest work rarely draws attention to itself. It settles, it anchors, it remains. If you are in a season where growth feels invisible, where faith feels steady but unspectacular, where obedience feels repetitive, let this be your reminder. God may be changing you more than you think. The absence of feeling is not the absence of formation, and one day, often unexpectedly, you will look back and realize how much has shifted beneath the surface. If you want a place to return when God's work feels slow and your growth feels unnoticed, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but for your journey, because the God who works quietly is still shaping something strong within you. Even now,